Ihr spezielles Interesse ist die Arbeit mit erwachsenen Arbeitssuchenden, die versuchen, am Arbeitsmarkt wieder Fuß zu fassen. Darüber hinaus hat sie auch zu Berufskarrieren von Jugendlichen und Erwachsenen geforscht. Bitte. Ja, ein kleiner Hinweis natürlich, der Vortrag wird jetzt auf Englisch sein. Wir werden aber versuchen, diesen Vortrag, also wir nehmen das heute alles auf Video auf, das heißt, der Vortrag wird dann in übersetzter Form auch noch vorliegen auf der Homepage in der Dokumentation. Ja. Ich habe Sie außerdem gebeten, heute vielleicht noch ein bisschen langsamer zu sprechen, als Sie das normalerweise tun, auch mit dem Hinweis, dass zwar in Österreich Englisch gesprochen wird, aber vielleicht nicht auf dem gleichen Niveau wie in Großbritannien. Falls es noch Verständnisfragen gibt oder sozusagen Übersetzungsprobleme gibt, dann kann man die sozusagen auch nachher noch erfragen.
Guten Tag. Vielen Dank, dass Sie mich zu Ihrem Seminar eingeladen haben. Dass ich Englisch sprechen darf. Wenn ich zu schnell spreche, bitte winken Sie mit einer Hand und ich werde versuchen, langsamer zu sprechen. My German teacher helped me. Okay. Now, my problem is that I don't know, of course, if Peter has already said things which I'm going to say. So, can you hear me? Yes. I apologise if Peter has already said things which I'm going to say. So, I think from the slides we're going to cover some of the same things, but I'll do perhaps in a different way. Okay. I was very pleased to be asked to prepare this talk, because I've done quite a lot of work on quality criteria, and particularly those detailed standards for career guidance, both the standards for qualifications and the standards that are used in quality assurance systems, that is, for the process. And I knew that... Closer. I'll try. I knew that group work was covered in the standards, so I thought it would be easy to separate out the standards that are about working in groups, because that's my theme for this morning, is quality in group work in guidance. So to do that, to look at group work particularly, it seemed to be a very useful job to do and an interesting one. But when I began to look more carefully, I realised it was not going to be so easy, and this morning I am going to talk to you a bit about the challenges of separating out group quality standards from the others. And I can only speak for the literature of the English language, but there, group work seems at best to be only tagged on to the main standards, and even then it's in a very hit and miss way. And this may be different in Austria, in which case I'd really like to know how you do it here. But in my experience with quality standards, the writing of these lists can be a very dry and technical subject. And it's difficult to do because there's a very precise grammar and logic to writing standards. And this dry grammar has a way of sucking the interest out of something that can be very lively and creative, which is the reality of good group work. So today I want to keep in touch with the reality, and instead of starting from theory of quality standards or from the international perspectives, which I think you've covered very well already, I'd like to start from the bottom, from looking at what actually happens. When I started to look at where group work was actually done and what quality criteria were used, I realised three things. Firstly, that some of the best group work in my country is done without using any detailed quality standards or quality criteria at all. And sometimes, where certain quality criteria were used, it made things difficult and worse for the clients and the staff and not better. And thirdly, it's not helpful to look at group work itself or the quality criteria in isolation from their context. Is that okay so far? Can you understand? So I thought one good way to approach it might be to take some examples from our experience in England. And I hope that that might raise issues that you would recognise in the Austrian context, and then maybe we can talk about that afterwards. And also, maybe later, I can go on to look at whether a transnational approach is helpful. Okay, now in my organisation, NICEC, National Institute, etc., we like to look across provision in all sectors and see what they can learn from each other. And this is what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try and tell a story, taking elements from different sectors. I'm going to take some examples that I think bring out some of the challenges for quality criteria for groups, and also highlight some of the great advantages of group work that should be part of any quality standards. And I will also ask, in whose interests is it that the quality should be good? That is, who are the stakeholders? Okay, so in England, who is providing the group work? And I think I've seen lists already like this from Peter's slides. So see, these are some of the different locations in my country of group guidance. In schools, for a primary school as well as secondary, for young people up to the age of 18. In vocational educational colleges, which is young people 16 to 19, but also many adults going back and doing vocational education and training in the same institutions. In universities and a number of other higher education settings. Now, I think we've talked a bit about that already, but I think also I want to look a bit at the adult sector, because it's happening for unemployed adults. They're getting some group guidance. Some adults who are in employment are getting group career management skills, but generally only what we call high flyers, the high achievers. But also more and more at the moment in the recession for adults who are in employment now, but have been told that they are going to lose their jobs. They're facing redundancy. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but I'm going to try and draw out some points from some of them. And the examples I'm going to take will highlight three main points that I think apply to the making quality, looking at quality criteria for these sectors. Some common issues are that guidance standards are often nested within other standards, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. There are many different funding bodies, and each use their own quality criteria for different reasons. And thirdly, and positively, professional associations have an important part to play in the development of quality standards. So I'm speaking from our experience here. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by nesting. I think you get the point. Career guidance in groups is often offered within or alongside other programs, and these programs each have their own systems of quality assurance. This means this is part of the explanation for why it is hard to find standards which are explicitly about group guidance that stand alone and do not need to be read alongside other standards. So my first example here about nesting is going to come from schools. Careers, education and guidance in our schools. Incidentally, I think that what you talked about is EBOP may correspond to what we call CEIAG, because the word guidance doesn't cover everything. CEIAG spells out career, education, information, advice and guidance. But I'm just going to talk about, I'm just going to use the word guidance, but we spend a lot of time in England discussing these words, and it's a terrible bore. So, career education and guidance in our schools is quality assured as part of all educational programmes by a government agency called Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education, Ofsted. Ofsted standards do not go into detail about careers work, although some of the outcomes they look for do come from careers work. But because they don't provide the detail, our government has also developed detailed standards for CEIAG. And it's these inner standards, the doll inside, that give the detail on the content that the programme should cover. They give teachers an idea of what the curriculum should be, and also what they should be doing with the other interested parties, such as parents and local employers. But they do not spell out the more generic points about group pedagogy, because those are covered in the outer layer, like the Ofsted standards. So that is the first obvious thing that makes group work different from one-to-one guidance work, is the pedagogy, and that should be in any set of quality criteria for group work. Group work standards should also convey why group work is a particularly good way of helping people with career management. It's not a second best, it's a good thing. And one reason is that people learn from the others in the group. Another is that you can bring in outside speakers and specialists, and most importantly perhaps that people in the group build up peer support, and by that I mean that the group members help and encourage each other. Now, in schools, in addition, the great advantage is that the programme can be improved over a period of years as each group passes through and teachers develop good practice. This is not so true in the other sectors I'm going to talk about. So, hold those points about schools. Now, I want to go on and talk a bit about funding and the different sectors. All of the types of group work in that first list I showed you are funded in different ways. So there are different government departments or different private organisations that want to be sure that the work is good. That's my illustration for that, funding differences. And in this context, I'm going to look at some of the programmes for unemployed adults. And to simplify things, I divided this into two broad kinds. Firstly, there are the official programmes to get people back to work. Here, the government wants to see lower unemployment figures and less money spent on social benefits. So that's the stakeholders and that's their interest. And the group provision in this sector mainly takes the form of what I call getting a job skill workshops. So that is, they're one-off workshops, maybe half a day, maybe one day, on some aspect of job search, like curriculum vitae, CV writing, or interview skills. I would not call them guidance, or career education, or career management, but they are part of that work, and they need meaningful quality criteria. So it's important that they don't slip under the radar of quality systems. But in this sector, perhaps because there is an element of compulsion in these programmes, a feeling has grown up among the guidance workers, the staff, and the clients, that group work is much less use than one-to-one work. So they feel they're getting a second best service, and that's a great shame. It's true that some of the advantages of group work we saw in schools are absent here, because there's no time to build up peer support in a short programme. The funding is never good enough to employ experienced, qualified staff who will stay with the programme. The funding is never long-term enough for them to develop expertise and improve their programmes. It's more complicated by the fact that the agencies that actually do this group work are subcontracted on an open market, and they are very varied. So you can see where quality standards become relevant here. It's very important that because it's quite free for all, it's very important that the quality is controlled well. But the official quality assurance that is used in these programmes is not specific to group work. The government is interested mainly in what we call hard outcomes, That is, the numbers of people getting a job or joining a training program at the end of the guidance experience. Now, these outcome measures are of course relevant to group work, but they're not specific to it, so it's not a way of differentiating what's special about group work. And our government is less, or they're interested, but it's not so important to them in what we call the soft outcomes of guidance, which may actually be more important in the long run. For example, increased confidence or the longer term career management skills. And these are particularly a feature of good group work. But in spite of this vacuum about quality assurance, or perhaps because of it, some interesting things are happening. The agencies that subcontract this kind of group work do have to be sure that the work is good. So some have been developing their own standards. I was shown one set of these internal standards, which I thought were excellent. I'll tell you why. They were tailored to the reality of what can be offered in that particular funding programme. They were short and clear and user-friendly. They covered the career-related content, but they also covered the processes of preparing and running a group. They required that client feedback is collected, and also, perhaps more unusually, they included detail of what that feedback should cover. So what did you want to know from the participants, the members of the group? Okay, so those are the public programmes. The second kind of group work for unemployed adults I want to talk about is what we call in the voluntary sector, or the third sector. And this is again hugely by contrast in a way, this is very, very varied. It's often funded by public money, but it's run by non-governmental organisations. So the great strength in this sector is that it can be targeted at specific groups with special needs, such as ex-prisoners or older adults, or people from one very local community, or one trade union group. Now, I'm mentioning those because I want to stress the very different kinds of work that needs to be covered by good quality standards for groups. But in this sector, it can take whatever form the providers can negotiate with the funders. It can sometimes go on over a longer period than the official programmes. Group members can gain confidence from their peer support, and it can be quite informal. And there are some quality criteria lessons that we can learn from this sector. The criteria they use are as varied as the funders and the agencies themselves. They range from overly tight quality criteria to overly loose quality criteria. And if the funding comes through the European Union, for example, I don't know if you have this experience, it often involves lengthy and detailed information about the clients and outcomes and premises, etc., etc. And it's so detailed that it actually puts off some of our non-NGOs, non-governmental organisations, from applying for this European money. That is, the quality control actually kills the provision. But at the other end of the spectrum, the only quality measure may be a client satisfaction questionnaire. Now, these are very important. I know they aren't enough to ensure good quality, but if the right information is collected, and if that is used in the right way, they are absolutely essential for running a good quality service. But the information should not just be used to boast about the high percentage of people who were happy about a service. You don't just say, oh, we had 85% thought it was great. What you're interested in are the 15% who are not happy and why they're not. And that doesn't happen often enough. Okay, now, the third example I was going to use this morning about professional associations. And it's very important that these play a part in the developing of quality criteria. Their codes of practice are potentially very important, for a start. And for this area, I'm going to take an example from guidance group work in universities. I apologise for the next slide. You would have to have it long. So it's professional associations and it's universities, and that was the best fit picture I could get off the internet in a short time. Our professional association for careers work in universities is called AGCAS. So that's you don't need to remember this, but it's the Association for Guidance Careers. What is it? I can't remember what it stands for, but it's universities. Now, AGCAS has gone far beyond a simple statement of principles. They run their own professional qualification with its own set of learning objectives. And these are not just about one-to-one work. They include a whole 4-day training program entirely about group work, covering nearly all the elements we might look for in a set of quality standards for this kind of work. I regard this as almost the best example of good practice that I found in England. So their group work course covers theories underpinning group work, planning, delivery and evaluation of group work, including client questionnaires, management facilitating for that, think of the word just teaching, and communication skills needed, including a range of skills. Now, the place of group work within the guidance process, i.e. not just how it fits in with one-to-one guidance, but also how it fits in with other support like information and work experience, etc. The ability to create, select, adapt, etc. materials, teaching materials, and most importantly, the ability to recognise and respond to the needs of different client groups and different people within the group. So what I'm doing here is I'm beginning to build up a set of elements that I think need to be covered in quality standards for group work. And so with AGCAS, that's just the training that they provide for their staff. But in addition, they have a relationship with that nesting picture I showed you at the beginning. Because in universities, in our university sector, we have an organisation called the Quality QAA, Quality Assurance Agency at the university sector, and they are the ones who devise the outer doll for quality assurance. And they asked ADCAS, the professional association, to help them write the detailed quality guidelines that should be used as part of their evaluation system. So it's a really good example of the professional association being used in the best way. But there's another point to make about the QAA quality criteria, that they are recommendations only, and they assume that universities will have their own quality assurance systems. So they do provide, as it were, a list of things that should be covered and the criteria, but they offer their standards as what they call precepts. That is, guidelines. Universities can check their own standards against the QAA precepts to be sure that they are covering everything they should be. And I'm going to be calling these precepts meta-criteria. I'll pick this up in the European context in a minute. The advantage is that these meta-criteria provide a framework, but they let the locals decide for themselves exactly what they want to do. I've got another example here from the private sector, but I think I'll come back to it at the end if we have time. I learnt about some work that the BBC are doing with their redundant staff, but we'll talk about that, I think, at the end if you want to know. But I'll just press on now. To summarise so far, we've seen, I've talked about at least 3 different kinds of group work. So that's the career education, career management, sort of thinking about career, learning about what is involved. We saw that in schools, and that happens to some extent for people in employment. But secondly, there group work which is about career guidance, about actually making immediate choices. So So that's a short-term problems now, but in context of learning about yourself and sort of more broad career issues. And then finally, these rather more simple, focused, what I'm calling getting a job skill workshops, where there's no wider education or guidance content. Now, they all need quality assurance, and we've got to have a system which is going to be useful, make sure we get best quality in all three kinds. And we've mentioned also different kinds of stakeholders, or those who have an interest in maintaining high standards. And this is all a cynical slide in a way, but I'll just talk you through it. So on one hand, we have the government, who are thinking about value for public money, so they've really got to be sure that the outcomes are worth it. We have the providing organisations, who, cynically, they need to show that they're providing a good quality service because they want to win future contracts in this space subcontracted world I talked about. We have staff who have a professional interest, and again, cynically, they think about their own career futures, they want to develop their professional expertise. And we have the clients and their families who really want the good help. And of course, the other three want to provide good help too. But you need to bear in mind that these two factors going on side by side, because while some of them are interested in the quality criteria to improve and deliver the best possible guidance work for their clients, they can also use any quality criteria that we write in a superficial way, just to tick the boxes, if you know what I mean, in order to obtain the future funding or jobs. And you have to make sure that the quality system you have can get around that box-ticking problem. Now, the quality criteria for group work, that I haven't mentioned all of them, but you'll recognise the list, I think, in general, is a whole range of different things. So your quality assurance system is going to be put together out of a number of different kinds of things. The standards for the first one is the process standards, then the professional qualification standards, then the meta criteria, which perhaps actually should come first. The curriculum shapes the quality. Professional codes of practice shape it. Legal obligations, which I didn't mention, which are very relevant to some of those government programmes, covering just things like health and safety and equal opportunities. Then the hard outcome measures, like what happens to the person. The soft outcome measures, which are most important, and the client satisfaction feedback. And some of these measures can be used for external formal assessment of the quality by some other agency. And some are much more important for use internally as a tool to improve provision gradually by the people who provide it. Now, when I was preparing this, I talked to the writers of standards in my country and to a lot of practitioners who deliver group work about what they saw as the issues. And they all agreed that we had very little in the English language official quality standards that is specific about groups. Some I have spoken to are quite angry about the bad practice that can be found as a result, that they feel their work is good and that other people's isn't, or that the government criteria crushes the work that they want to do and they can't do what they regard as being good work. This seems to me was our problem, and I hope it's not a problem for you. But given that there are some very good examples of group work, and even some good examples of quality criteria for groups, my question was, why is there so little about group work in our main national standards, and, I should say, the international ones that I've looked at? One reason is what I'm calling the problem of open weave. That's, the image there would be like a fishing net, which is where the net is too big and fish swim through it and they're not caught by it. Open weave. When these lists of standards are written for formal external assessment, there's a tension about how specific the standard and its performance criteria should be. Being very specific limits their application, but being more general makes them vaguer and therefore more open to abuse through box ticking. Our main quality system for guidance in the UK is called Matrix. It's been very successful because it is so open weave, and organisations from every different sector are very keen on Matrix, and you can get a Matrix quality mark. And then it shows that the work you do in career guidance is really good, and you can get it for group work as well. But it's so open weave, it makes no mention at all of group work, specifically as distinct from guidance with individuals. So if you're trying to develop your group work, it's actually not much use to you. And another reason for the invisibility of group work comes from another version of the nesting problem. It's difficult to draw a clear line between the standards for group guidance and the standards for one-to-one work. Many of the skills overlap. Of course they do. You want that people who are doing group guidance, you want them to be experts in one-to-one guidance as well. But the focus has always been on that first. So when the equality standards mention group work, they rarely, very rarely explain what is different about it. For example, the International Association for Educational and Vocational Guidance, in English that's IAEVG, but it's also, yes, you know what I'm talking about. It has a system of quality standards for practitioners, and that list lists 91 competence statements for good guidance. Of that 91, only one is about groups, and all that one says is use group counselling techniques. I mean, it doesn't say anything at all about what they should be. Now, I've worked on some projects to write international quality standards. There have been attempts to write standards that would apply across all countries, and I know that that's an ongoing project at European level. It's hard to write specific standards internationally because, as I've said, there's a very precise grammar to writing standards. So it's very culture and language specific. And the other problem is that even before you've finished, they can be out of date because countries' educational systems change so quickly. I once worked on a project which involved 5 countries, so there were 5 languages, and there must have been at least 100 different guidance contexts that they were supposed to apply to. And we worked on this for over 2 years, and we'd only just made a start, and it's still carrying on, I'm glad to say. But because of this problem, the CEDEFOP and the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, ELGPN, have adopted what I've called the meta-criteria approach, which involves, as I said, listing the topics that the standards should cover, but not spelling out the detail of exactly what the content should be. And this makes good sense. But if their meta-criteria frameworks are going to be useful for group work, they must make very clear what are the most distinctive features of good group work. And none of the European or international standards that I have seen do this. A recent CEDEFOP report on competencies of career practitioners, they could see a problem, but instead of addressing group work individually, they said that for each of the guidance competencies, people should be able to do them on a one-to-one basis in a group, by telephone, online. So they were covering themselves, but they weren't actually telling us what is specific about group work. And I think it's very important because I think group work is it has its own standing within careers guidance. So the meta-criteria have got to spell out what makes good group work. In which case, what criteria, having made these complaints, I have to say a bit about what I think would help to raise the quality of group guidance. What kind of criteria do we need? So, looking at the examples, the ideas from all the examples that I've talked about, I think the most effective quality system would be worked out at a local level for group work of particular kind with particular goals for specific target groups, like that sector of adult guidance that I mentioned. But that these should be drawn up within a framework set by meta-criteria agreed at a national level. And I think that these could be made to cover all the target groups I've talked about. And all the professional associations involved should be in writing the meta-criteria. So, just in summary, I'm nearly there, the quality criteria for group work needs a national framework for meta-criteria, which should cover structure and process factors such as funding, premises, resources and staffing, but the ones specifically about group work, not in a more abstract way. And that in the meta criteria for staffing, the staff should have a commitment to and an understanding of the value of group work. Those things I mentioned earlier about what it can contribute, which are different from one-to-one work. And then also those, they should be I think most of those ones in that list are things that I showed you before from the AGCAS training programme. They need to have qualifications in one-to-one guidance as well as group work. And they need to have a grasp of the theories, planning, delivery, evaluation, and then the teaching skills, place of group work in the guidance process, use of materials, and recognising and responding to the needs of different client groups. So that's really all I have to say on it. If you want any of the examples that I've mentioned, I'll be very happy to send them to you by email, and that's my email address, but of course they'll be in English.
Thanks a lot. Es gibt an dieser Stelle wieder die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch. Auf Deutsch werde ich versuchen zu übersetzen. Keine Frage? Thanks a lot.